My name is Dan Matthews. I'm an associate professor of theater design and technology at Ohio State-Lima, and this is Czech and Slovak theatrical stage design of the 20th century. We will examine the prolific and unique scenographers from the region and, by doing so, also explore the incredibly interesting history and culture of the Czech and Slovak regions. You will also learn how the term Bohemian, which describes a region in the Czech Republic, came to describe socially unconventional artistic folks. Scenography is a term that isn't commonly used in American theater. Basically, it's the designing of scenery and sometimes lighting and/or costumes for theatrical productions, without necessarily using illusion to reproduce realistic settings. Rather, the focus is to create designs that are expressive and support action on stage. So why study the Czech Republic and Slovakia? Well, first of all, let's talk about the names of the countries a bit. Your parents or your grandparents may refer to Czechoslovakia because for most of the 20th century, the two countries were linked as one. Also, in 2013, the government of the Czech Republic voted to adopt the shortened name Czechia. Some folks use that name, some don't. For this presentation, I'll be using the longer version. For me, it just comes down to personal preference. So again, why these countries? They are right in the center of Europe, surrounded and influenced by powerful countries and kingdoms throughout history. Despite this, these relatively small countries have managed to maintain their unique Slavic cultures and characteristics and have come to be known as a crossroads of European culture. It's important that we examine why and how the Czech and Slovak people are so closely related. We can start with geography. Located right in the center of Europe, the Czech and Slovak lands are partially surrounded by mountains and, at least historically, somewhat hard to get to. The area was populated by Celtic pagans, with some Roman settlements during most of early European history. The fall of the Roman Empire around 400 or 500 AD led to a sharp decrease in population. Around this time, Slavic tribes from what is now Russia started immigrating to Eastern, Central, and Southern Europe. These different Slavic tribes shared roots, but over time, they've maintained separate identities, which have helped shape their nations into the 20th century. The Czech and Slovak lands can be split into separate regions based on historical differences in language and culture. Even though now the cultures are much more homogenized, they still maintain their identities and have some unique cultural institutions like universities and museums. There is Bohemia in the west, with the capital city of Prague. Moravia is mostly in the eastern part of the Czech Republic, but it extends into parts of modern Slovakia. Silesia is in the north, and most of that region is actually in Poland. Slovakia, with the capital of Bratislava near the Austrian border, shares a relatively short border with the Czech Republic. And in the far eastern part of that country, we have Ruthenia, which is mostly in Ukraine. As you can imagine, many Silesians identify with Polish folks, and many Ruthenians identify with Ukrainians. Previous to this Slavic migration, sometimes erroneously called the barbarian invasion, a great deal of the Czech lands were occupied by a Celtic tribe called the Boii. This is where the term Bohemia comes from. We'll discuss how it became used as a common descriptor for artistic folks with alternative lifestyles in a bit. The history of these regions is incredibly interesting and, at times, quite theatrical. The defenestrations of Prague are a great example of that. In case you didn't know, a defenestration is the act of throwing someone out of a window, and Prague has had two infamous occurrences. The first one, in 1419, helped spark a religious uprising that led to the Hussite Wars, which lasted 15 years. A crowd of Hussites who were early Czech Protestants were angry that the ruling Catholics in Prague wouldn't release Hussite prisoners. They broke into town hall and threw 7 town council members, including a judge, to their deaths. The second happened in 1618. Several Protestant lords were upset that the Holy Roman Emperor had sent a letter to stop the construction of a Protestant church on royal lands. They suspected that two Catholic lords and their secretary were to blame for the letter and confronted them during an official meeting in Prague. The Catholic lords and their secretary admitted their guilt, believing they would only be arrested. However, they were quickly thrown out of a third-story window and fell 70 feet. The Catholics said it was divine intervention and angels saved them. The Protestants said the men landed in a cart of manure. Either way, they all survived, and both sides started raising armies. The events that followed led to the 30 Years' War, in which 4.5 to 8 million people died, and the balance of power in Europe was completely changed. Yes, their culture and history is quite interesting, but why study their theater? Looking back to the early history of the Slavic people, we can see that pagan ritual, heavy with mimicry and pageantry, was one of the ways history and social morality was passed from generation to generation. When Christianity took hold in the 10th century, medieval mystery and passion plays continued those traditions. Puppetry also gained popularity in Central Europe during this time, not only as simple entertainment on the street for children, but as full-blown theatrical events with highly skilled puppeteers using complicated marionettes to retell classic stories. To this day, there are many active puppet theaters across the area. The emotion that the puppeteers and puppet creators can convey is breathtaking. The art form is truly valued as much more than simply fun stuff for kids, which, unfortunately, is how much of America views puppetry. Theatrical storytelling has nearly always been a central part of Czech and Slovak culture. To this day, even tiny villages in the countryside have vibrant, active community theaters, and jokes involving clever wordplay and puns get the most laughs. Their playwrights are held up as celebrities and historically important figures, as we'll learn in a bit. Perhaps surprisingly, works by foreign playwrights like Shakespeare, Molière, or Ibsen are constantly being put on, and the various Czech and Slovak translations of those works are often compared, admired, and scrutinized by scholars of theater and language. To put it in a nutshell, they just love theater and value how it can support and even lead a culture to be better. The people of the Czech Republic and Slovakia have been at the whim of history for a long time. Hundreds of years of occupiers, fascist rule, or being part of empires ruled by outsiders has had an effect on folks. For a long time in many cities, German or Hungarian was the main language used, and the Czech and Slovak languages survived in the home and in rural areas. This caused the preservation of language and culture to become incredibly important to the Czechs and Slovaks, especially during the Czech national revival of the 18th and 19th centuries and the Slovak national revival of the 19th century, when authors, scholars, and artists began to take pride in and focus on their Slavic culture, history, and language. Theater was an integral part of these cultural revivals. Before the 1860s, all theaters and operas in Prague were owned by Austrians. In the Estates Theater, one of the jewels of Prague's theater scene, Czech plays were only sporadically performed from its construction in 1783 until 1812, when it added Sunday performances in Czech to attract a bigger audience. By the way, this theater was the site of the premiere of Mozart's opera, Don Giovanni, in 1787. It was also a major filming location for the movie Amadeus in 1984, and fees from the filming helped fund its restoration. In 1860, these regular Czech productions at the Estates Theater stopped for a very important reason. The Czech people had been raising their own funds since 1844 to build a national theater, and in 1862, on the banks of the Vltava River, they built the Provisional Theater. This temporary building housed plays and operas written by and for Czechs, while the bigger and more opulent National Theater was being planned. Eventually, the new building was completed in 1881, with part of the Provisional Theater being incorporated into the architecture. Though the building looks neoclassical, there are many elements that focus on the Slavic traditions that had regained popularity during the revival, like the painted fire curtain, which displays an allegory. The embodiment of the nation received gifts from the people as workers rebuild the theater surrounded by Czech symbols. This is because after only 12 performances of the premiere production of Smetana's opera Le Buse, the theater was closed so some interior work could be completed. While that work was being done, a fire broke out, and the roof, stage, and auditorium were destroyed. This tragedy was felt deeply by the Czech people, and they were able to raise enough money for the restoration in a matter of months, whereas it had taken decades to raise the funds for the initial construction. The repairs were finished in a little more than 2 years, and the building stands today as part of a complex of stages, including the Estates Theater, run by the National Theater under the Czech Ministry of Culture. The Slovak National Theater was founded in 1920. They started performing opera, theater, and ballet in the Hvězdoslav Theater in the heart of Bratislava. The theater was renovated, and a large underground complex with rehearsal rooms was added in the late 1960s. The chandelier that was added during this time contains 2,532 light bulbs with millions of programmable combinations. That theater is still used by the Slovak National Theater today. In 2007, the long-awaited new building was completed. With separate theaters for plays, opera, and ballet, this state-of-the-art facility is massive and complex. Built over decades, with many changes along the way, its completion is a testament to the Slovak people's love of theater. Now that we know a bit about why theater is so important to the Czechs and Slovaks, you may be asking, why scenography? Theater is sort of a melting pot of art forms. It blends visual, performance, and literary art to recreate worlds on stage. And scenography is central to creating the spectacle that sucks audiences in and makes the experience more immediate. It's the first thing the audience sees, and the impression the design makes on them carries through the entire experience. It can reflect current affairs and the zeitgeist in an immediately understandable visual and visceral way. For many reasons, the Czechs and Slovaks led the way throughout most of the 20th century. Remember that because of location, these lands have always been a cultural crossroads of sorts, becoming a melting pot of outside influences, yet keeping their own cultures intact. During the first half of the 20th century, art of all kinds, including scenography, was advancing more quickly than it had ever done before. Folks were constantly trying to create something new yet poignant. This was absolutely true of the Czechs and Slovaks, whose early 20th century scenographers garnered a worldwide reputation as some of the best, and laid the groundwork for their successors to continue advancing what could be done on stage throughout the 20th century, despite 40 years of totalitarian rule and relative isolation. Before we delve into the work of specific scenographers, we should look more closely at how and why the world came to recognize Bohemian as a way to describe creative folks who push boundaries. It started with the intense focus on art and culture that was part of the Czech and Slovak national revivals. These social movements fostered a nationwide respect for how visual, literary, and performance art could uphold cultural values, while at the same time forcing positive societal change. The following generations carried that respect into the early 20th century. Then World War I changed everything. Europe was no longer full of large empires and powerful royal families like the Habsburgs, who had ruled the Czech and Slovak lands as part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire since the 16th century. By the way, what they called keeping the bloodlines pure, we call incest. It led to what became known as the Habsburg Jaw, which is hard to miss. These forces were constantly vying for control of territories occupied by smaller groups that were often tied by a common culture and language. Just look at how complicated this map of the Holy Roman Empire's separate kingdoms was. After World War I, many of these ethnic groups were able to create their own nations. Thus, we have the birth of the first Czechoslovak state in October of 1918. Throughout much of the world, this period between the wars began as one of deep reflection on the new horrors brought about during World War I and the changes that were happening in the world's power structure. While Europe was rebuilding after the destruction, there was slow economic growth and little prosperity, but eventually that growth sped up. In the Czech and Slovak lands, for the first time, the pressures of economics and politics were less importance. People's spirits began to rise, and new and old cultural institutions were able to fund artistic ventures. This led to an explosion of artistic movements and creativity that had started at the turn of the century but had been stifled and forever altered by World War I. The Czech and Slovak lands were literally at the center of it. This is when the term Bohemian was first assigned its double meaning. In theater, the main institutions and production companies that had existed for decades continued to do good work. However, there were now many smaller theaters who were pursuing different ways to tell stories and communicate ideas on stage. In his book, Modern Czech Theater, Czech-American theater scholar Jarka Burian describes the 1920s Prague theater scene this way. The plays and the methods of producing them also embodied virtually all current artistic modes, with the most significant productions having one tendency in common: the flight from the dead center of illusionistic realism. Instead, expressionism, constructivism, Dada, surrealism, theatricalism, and the special Czech variation of these isms, poetism, which accentuated playful fantasy, marked much of the outstanding work of this era, as did the esprit of such parenthetical forms as the circus and the cabaret. Interestingly, during this interwar period, though much was happening in Czech theater, the work of directors and scenographers has historically held more importance than that of playwrights, with a few exceptions. Karl Čapek is one who is certainly worth mentioning. Having only been active from 1920 until his untimely death of pneumonia just before the start of World War II in 1938, he managed to produce dozens of plays and novels, various non-fiction works, articles, and essays. His were plays of ideas and conflicting principle, exploring complicated social situations in fantastical ways, though he was not known for developing especially deep characters. One of his best-known plays, RUR, or Rossum's Universal Robots, is notable for being the root of the word robot, which is said to have been coined by Karl's brother Josef, a famous illustrator, painter, and scenographer, who often worked with Karl. His illustrations of his characters Doggy and Pussycat are charming and still quite popular. This one hangs on my toddler's wall. Tragically, Josef Čapek, who spoke out against Nazism and Adolf Hitler, was arrested by secret police after Germany invaded Czechoslovakia in 1939. He was sent to a concentration camp where he died in 1945. Jarka Burian says this of RUR. RUR presents a prototypical Čapek situation. A fantasy-like plot device is introduced into a contemporary realistic frame of action. In this case, it is a formula for the creation of lifelike robots, who will eliminate human toil and give promise of a paradise on Earth. In essence, it is a science fiction melodrama, symptomatic of Čapek's concern for the survival of human values in an increasingly mechanized technocratic world. The robots rebel and almost wipe out the human race except for one survivor. He is saved from complete despair when he realizes that two of the robots, a male and a female, show signs of affection for one another. He sees Adam and Eve in them, the beginnings of a new, still human race. The first production, with scenery designed by architect Bedřich Feuerstein, brought world attention to Czech theater for the first time. A contemporary of Bedřich Feuerstein, Vlastislav Hoffman was also trained as an architect. Before he started working as a scenographer, he was well known as one of the few architects and designers who adapted cubism to buildings and decorative art. Czech cubism became a unique style that can still be seen in and around Prague. His colorful, exaggerated designs often drew on the aesthetics of Czech Cubism, even though he left that part of his career behind in 1919. He won several international awards for scenography later in his career, and his designs were loved by critics for their ability to capture the essence of a scene, while extending far beyond realism. Upon receiving one award, he said, "If I have to talk about my nerve, I can only say that the characteristic expressiveness which some people find in my designs is maybe caused by my frequent sullenness or something similar. It must be behind it somewhere, for otherwise no prescription exists for what is actually dramatic." Hoffmann designed the scenery for a 1939 production of RUR that was mounted in honor of Karl Čapek's death. The Act 1 scene has an Art Deco feel that creates a pleasing facade reminiscent of institutional buildings. The monumental columns, windows, and RUR lettering serve to display the company's acumen in business while giving the room a sense of oppression. The renderings for the second act in Helen Glory's drawing room again display Hoffmann's knowledge of interior design and architecture. When studying his work and the work of his successors, it's easy to see how he influenced Czech scenography for years to come. As we know, this heady time between the wars was not meant to last. Before the Nazis ever invaded another country with their armies, they took over a large part of Czechoslovakia along the German border called Sudetenland. There was a German-speaking majority in the area, and there had been a movement among Germans across Europe to unite their people. In an effort to appease the rising threat of Hitler and the Nazis, British, Italian, French, and German leaders agreed to allow Germany to annex the territory by signing the Munich Agreement in September of 1938, without any representation from Czechoslovakia. German soldiers moved in soon after, and any Czechs were quickly expelled. In March of 1939, Slovakia declared its independence and allied itself with Germany. Germany then swiftly occupied the rest of the Czech lands with almost no resistance from the rest of Europe. This was the end of the First Czechoslovak Republic, and the beginning of 6 long years of fascist Nazi rule. This was a dark time for the people, but art and culture was able to occur in a limited fashion, though it was now highly restricted and censored by the Nazis. One of the next big players in Czech and Slovak scenography, František Trester, had many of his shows canceled by the occupational authorities because of anti-fascist interpretations. Starting as an architect, designer, and decorator, he didn't start working prolifically as a scenographer until 1934. He worked a great deal at famous theaters like the National Theatre in Prague and the Slovak National Theatre before the war. But in 1944, he was forced to leave theater because he was designated as a degenerate artist and a displaced person by the Nazis. He would continue to work under some of his friends' names. When the war in Europe ended, he was able to return to work establishing the Institute for Stage Design at the Academy of Fine Arts in Prague in 1946, where he was the director until his death in 1968. Teaching became his passion, and he is directly responsible for inspiring some of the best scenographers of the 20th century. Trester was a long-time student of design, and he had a deep understanding of artistic styles. He adapted that knowledge to his stage designs with a constant focus on dramatic function rather than any specific style of the day. He was deeply concerned with how his structures would interact with actors' movements on stage, creating greater theatrical effect. To him, the space had to support the action. In 1964, he was quoted as saying, "The basis of stage action is space. The stage itself is a hollow cube into which an artificial dramatic space has to be inserted." Later in his career, he began to focus on the intangible elements of stage design, like movement, time, rhythm, and lighting. He began to see lighting not as a method of creating mood, but as a way of shaping structures on stage and creating texture. These revelations were passed along to the next two designers we will discuss, who in turn shaped Czech and Slovak scenography for years to come. Josef Svoboda and Ladislav Východil. We must ask ourselves, what effect had being ruled by a totalitarian communist party and essentially being a puppet state of the Soviet Union from 1949 to 1990 had on culture? Well, it's incredibly complicated. Since all art was heavily censored by the state during this time, some theatrical artists became very good at delivering undermining messages against the state without saying anything overtly negative about the state. They could do this through creative selection of classic plays with similar messages to theirs. They could also use literary devices like irony and metaphor. Sometimes the scenography itself could hide some metaphoric inner meaning that the audience members in the know would recognize. Other theater artists were, at times, more open with their messages against the Communist Party. Many artists were relegated to small-town theaters, forced out of work entirely, arrested by secret police, imprisoned, or they simply disappeared. The state truly controlled nearly every aspect of life, and without their blessing, it was difficult to bring theater to audiences. However, some theater makers were willing to work with the party, many even being party members. If you had the backing of the party, that meant you had access to the resources you needed to put on shows. Remember, there was no such thing as private property at this time, let alone private business. Supposedly, everything was owned by the people and divvied up between them by the government. As a concept, this may seem fine, but in practice, when a certain group of people wield power over the rest, they often become corrupt and paranoid. There were times during this era of totalitarian rule when limits on speech, travel, and the media were somewhat lessened. Culminating in 1968, massive protests across the country led to a time of political liberalization called the Prague Spring. During this period, artists and especially theaters played a big part in rallying people to promote change. However, when the economy was partially decentralized, the Soviets stepped in to curb these changes. In August, 600,000 troops from neighboring countries like Poland and Ukraine, with tanks and state-of-the-art Soviet weapons, marched into Czechoslovakia. The Soviets thought it would take 4 days to subdue the population and reinstate strict communist rule. Because of efforts to befriend foreign soldiers, sabotage street signs, general defiance of rules like curfews, sporadic violence, and several protest suicides by fire, the occupation went on for 8 months until the Soviets agreed to allow some moderate reforms. However, the next year, a new government was put in power and a period called normalization began. Stringent crackdowns on freedom and increased government surveillance and censorship began. These restrictions would stay in place until the end of the Cold War in the late 80s. If, as an artist, you are willing to abide by the communist system if not support it, and you were particularly talented, the patronage a totalitarian government could provide was immense. Josef Svoboda was one such artist. A student of František Trester, Svoboda became the principal designer for the National Theatre in 1948 at the age of 28. He would serve in that role, which is perhaps the most prestigious for a scenographer in the Czech lands, for 30 years. During his 50-year career, he designed over 700 shows, many of them international. This was almost unheard of in a country where most people weren't allowed to leave. Since, for the most part, he was in good standing with the communists and they knew his work was popular abroad, they let him go as a matter of good publicity for the country. Svoboda created non-realistic spaces using light, movement, and rhythm to create truly dynamic, epic stage designs. Since he had the full support of the government, he was able to experiment and try things that had never really been done before. He wasn't just fascinated with design. but also with stage technology, optics, acoustics, mechanics, and electronics. This interdisciplinary approach is a big part of why he is so well known among theater makers across the world, and it led to one of his greatest contributions, Laterna Magica. Premiering in 1958 and continuing to produce work to this day, Laterna Magica was the world's first multimedia theater. Collaborating with famous Czech director Alfred Rudok, Svoboda found ways to incorporate live action on stage with projections of scenes that had been filmed earlier. Now we see the use of projections as a common part of theater design, but at the time this work was groundbreaking, using state-of-the-art technology. Laterna Magica has had its own theater building right next to the National Theatre in Prague since 1984. They continue to produce new work as well as classic pieces from their past. 1977's Wonderful Circus is still performed today and is the most performed theater piece in Central Europe. While Svoboda's career was taking off in the Czech lands, another of František Trester's protégés was experiencing similar success in Slovakia. Ladislav Vychodil became the principal designer for the Slovak National Theatre in Bratislava shortly after Svoboda did in Prague. In 1952, he founded a stage design department at the Academy of Performing Arts in Bratislava, where he would teach and inspire generations of Slovak scenographers. Since the Slovak National Theatre had very minimal shop space in which to build scenery, Vychodil took it upon himself to design a new complex that was state-of-the-art in the 50s and is still impressive today. The multi-shop space has an exact replica of the stage space at the old Slovak National Theatre, complete with rigging and lighting, so an entire set can be mocked up before even being taken to the theater. European theaters tend to run their seasons in repertory fashion, so the show changes every night. This means that scenery is constantly being struck, stored, and then loaded into the theater again. Vychodil's genius solution was to create a storage house with bays for storing scenery and props on 3 different levels. A huge tracking elevator was built that could be moved up and down the length of the building and raised up to any of the 3 levels. Essentially, it's a large vending machine for scenery, and it's truly unique. Vychodil's designs, much like Trester's, show careful attention to rhythm, light, and space. However, his work takes on a much more linear graphic aspect, with shapes often being defined by arrays of lines. His renderings tend to have an airy quality to them that is very painterly. His designs, though grounded to the stage, seem to want to float away because of his attention to negative space. Where Svoboda came in to work in established spaces and institutions, Vychodil had to create his own. This was only possible because of his creativity and the backing of the Slovak Communist Party. Still, it's a testament to his dedication and passion for stage design. Though there may have been many notable and successful Slovak scenographers, no one has done more to build the programs and facilities that have allowed Slovak stage design to develop past being seen as a subsidiary of the Prague theater scene. One of Trester's later students, Jaroslav Malina, came into prominence during the normalization period in Czechoslovakia. A longtime painter, his imaginative style advances Trester's attention to incorporating action within the stage design. In the 1970s, he was one of the founders of action scenography, a style in which the actor is the focus of the stage design, and the scenery's meaning and representation changes depending on how the performers interact with it. Malina, a true bohemian in every sense, also developed new ways of using different materials on stage. In her article, Trends in 20th Century Czech Scenic Design, Vera Pachkova says, "He stood previous accepted beliefs on their heads and took on the struggle for the cleansing of theatrical media. He preferred natural materials not only because of their authenticity and reality, but because of their uncliched emotive effect, and for their new dramatic quality. Drapery was for him a potential space for painting, the bearer of color, softness, changeability. Emotivity and sensuousness, the determining qualities of Molyneux's signature, were cultivated by experience both from theater and from painting, for Molyneux is one of the few to concurrently maintain continuity in his painting. A self-professed barbarian and not known for abiding by all of the limitations on freedom set forth during normalization, Molyneux was relegated to lesser opera theaters in smaller cities for many years. Yet, his advancements and unique painterly aesthetic still sets him apart as one of the most influential Czech scenographers. He taught at the Academy of Performing Arts in Prague and universities in the United States, Japan, Finland, and Great Britain, and his paintings and designs are held by museums and institutions around the world. Jaroslav Molyneux designed and painted until his death in 2016. Having met him a few times, I can say he was generous, kind, hilarious, and always willing to share his experience. He is greatly missed by many. On November 17th of 1989, riot police in Prague attacked and violently broke up a peaceful student demonstration. Meanwhile, Václav Havel, a playwright, human rights activist, longtime target of the secret police, and recently released political prisoner, had been working to build support for a widespread movement to dismantle the one-party communist system. This movement took hold when Havel, his organization, actors, audience members, and other institutions met in a theater in Prague to form the Civic Union, which became a loosely based organization aimed at overthrowing the communist regime. Theaters around the country went on strike days after the attack. Along with students, scholars, artists, and scientists, they began using their spaces as venues where they called for the dismissal of top officials because of the November 17th violence. After 10 days of nationwide general strikes and peaceful protests, sometimes with more than 500,000 people present, the government agreed to dissolve. By December 10th, the first non-communist government in 41 years was instated. Soon after, Václav Havel was elected as president. The transition was so smooth and without major incident that it became known as the Velvet Revolution. In 1992, after more than 70 years of joint existence, Slovakia and the Czech Republic amicably decided to form separate states in the Velvet Divorce. The role of theater spaces as public forums and the efforts of theater makers to change minds and push people to action during this time is remarkable, and it shows the importance of strong cultural centers when it comes to the fight for representation. The fall of the totalitarian communist government opened the country up to outside influences that had been restricted for so long. Once an international crossroads of culture, the Czech Republic and Slovakia welcomed new travelers, colleagues, and collaborators. However, many cultural institutions had to learn how to navigate a new capitalist financial structure where they could no longer depend on as much state funding. There are now more theater companies aimed at tourists, featuring spectacle and cheap entertainment. The Broadway musical, Love It or Hate It, is now an expected part of some repertoires where it would never have been considered before. There are many new groups creating alternative styles and advancing theater arts. Established institutes continue to train new generations. But of course, the system isn't perfect. At the Academy of Performing Arts in Prague, a student-led initiative began in July of 2021. They are speaking out about discriminatory behavior at their school and in the industry in general. They seek to create a new normal based on gender equality. Time will tell what changes they will make, but I wouldn't bet against young Czechs or Slovaks. The Bohemian spirit is still very much alive. Thank you. you.